Well, thanks for coming back, first of all. I guess yesterday wasn't too bad. Most of you seem to be back. Today I'll be talking as I don't know exactly what Vukashin said, so I might repeat exactly what he just said. But I'll be talking about ideas and co-founders and sort of topics related to that, and sort of pitfalls that you see in the startup world and ways you can kind of try to avoid them. The plan for tonight, if this works. Okay, it all works at the same time. Right. The plan for tonight is to cover 5 loosely related topics about ideas, good and bad, and what it means, a good idea and a bad idea, about idea reach, which is a very useful idea when a very useful concept when trying to come up with ideas that are actually worth following. A few co-founder horror stories that hopefully won't happen to too many people around here, but may happen to some. How to deal with co-founders, how to approach co-founders to try and avoid those horror stories happening to you. And then some final thoughts on shares and employees. And I know the talk after me is going to be about shares as well and about vesting and things like that. So you'll probably get a lot more information as well out of that second talk about this topic. So, ideas. Ideas are the starting point of most businesses, of most startups. People often start, well, almost always start with an idea of what they want to do, and they build from there. And unfortunately, they very rarely stop to ask themselves whether the idea is good or bad. They kind of have this idea, they assume that because the idea is there and it seems to make sense to them, it must be a good idea. So perhaps it's worth starting by asking what is a bad idea? And I'll open this question to the floor. Just raise your hand and suggest what do you think is a bad idea? Obviously not in the context of going and playing with lions, but of going and starting a startup.
Facebook killer.
Okay, fair enough. Anybody else? So Facebook killer, the next Google.
Like really saturated market of some sort.
So, okay, so bad idea is going into a really saturated market where you won't be able to make.
Small market, like Serbia.
Or going into a really small market, and that's a good one, because that's something that happens very often to a lot of startups. Is not so much that the country is a very small market, but that they target a very small niche where there's not really enough market to sustain a business. Anyone else?
Not thinking about how to monetize it.
That's okay. I'm not thinking about how to monetize. I'm repeating it for the mic. Not thinking about how to monetize the startup. That's a very common mistake. People start with, well, I'm going to build this thing and it sounds cool, it sounds interesting, I like it, and then they don't actually think about how it's going to turn into a business at the end of it. Anyone else? I can throw in a few. Probably the most common reason why startup, in fact, according to the Startup Genome Project, I went and analyzed a lot of startup failures. The most common reason why startups fail is because they build something that nobody wants. So if you remember my story from yesterday, Vocalix, we built something that nobody actually wanted. And so that meant that the entire effort of building that product was effectively wasted because nobody actually wanted that. The sort of next version, next step is building something people might want, but they don't want to pay for. And that was the mistake I made on Rubius. It was something people wanted, but they didn't really want to pay for it, and the thing that they wanted to pay for was different. The small market is something some people want to pay for, but there's not enough of them. Another one that happens more rarely, but is actually somewhat semi-common, is trying to build something that's impossible to deliver, as in something that for you is impossible to deliver. Because if you can't go and build this thing, it might be a great idea, but it's a great idea for somebody else. Another one that also unfortunately happens and is very difficult to avoid and is very inevitable almost when it happens to you, is when you try to build something too early, where it is a good idea, it is something that is going to be huge and is going to make a big difference, but you're 5 years too early. And because it is a good idea, you'll look for evidence and you'll find that, okay, this is worth doing, but then if you were, for example, to try and build YouTube in 1997, when the internet was just getting started and everybody was on dial-up and there were very few people on the internet and there wasn't much digital video, it might have been a really great idea, a few years later, but in 1997 it would have been a terrible idea, and you might have spent all your energy trying to build this crowdsourced video sharing site and found that it keeps failing over and over again for years until you give up, and then suddenly in the next year YouTube comes out and sells for $1.6 billion a few years later. So the key point is that there's really a million different ways that you can fail, and most ideas that you're going to come up with are going to be basically failures. They're going to be things that, out of all the space of possible ideas that you might pick, if you pick one that you like, chances are you're going to pick one that's going to fail. And that is an important concept, because we'll be talking a lot about this tomorrow as well, about how to try and explore the idea and figure out whether it's a failing one or a successful one. But one of the reasons I want to talk about it tonight as well is because beyond the approach of going and finding out whether an idea is good or bad, there's also the very process of how you get that initial spark of a business idea that ends up starting you on that path of creating a business. And usually the way it starts with most people, especially new entrepreneurs, is that they start with some cool thing that they think they want to build. It starts with maybe an itch that they have, that they want to scratch, some kind of problem that they have in their life, where they think quite naturally, well, if I have this problem and I really want to solve it, there must be lots of other people who have this problem, and therefore it must be worth building a business around this. And then they get started, they get really passionate about the idea because it affects them personally, they go on with it, and then much later, a year, 2 years later, they might find out that actually this idea didn't really have a market, or it has a market of one or a few hundreds, but not enough to sustain an actual business there. A better approach that we kind of touched on yesterday is what is basically the job of the entrepreneur, which is to go and find those business opportunities and figure out how to exploit them. And if you talk to experienced entrepreneurs, you'll find that they have lots of ideas, which all sound pretty reasonable and sound like they have a market. They just don't have the time to go and work on all of them because they're working on their current idea. But the way they get their ideas, and there's these many ideas that seem like good ideas, is they don't start with, I could build this cool thing. They just look out for opportunities. This is something that comes naturally once you've been running a business for a while, because part of your job as an entrepreneur is to spot those opportunities that are going to help your business to actually exist, to actually survive. So you get in the habit of finding ways to make money. And then even after your business finishes, you'll then carry that habit with you and use it to look at other options to start the next business. So this is a different approach because it starts from the opportunity, from the how can I make money from this. And it's difficult to change people's mindset, I've found, if they are beginner entrepreneurs and they are starting with the mindset of I want to build this cool thing. It is a pretty big gap to jump from that to let me look for ways that I can make money. Usually that comes about with experience, but one of the ways that I've found that I suggest to people usually, and it seems to work for some people, is that it starts by looking around you. So if you look around you right now to this room, almost everything that you see, except for the people, is here because of a business. Every item around you, here in the street, you have to go to the middle of the forest to find places where most things aren't created by businesses. And most of those businesses make money. And that's a really useful insight to change your mindset, because if there's so many different ways to make money, then it must be possible to sort of find more of them and find new ways to combine them. And the next thing you should get into the habit of doing is to try to analyze how these other businesses make money. When you look at all these different things, whether they're web services or they're shoe stores or they're shoe manufacturers or they're any kind of business that you see, try to get in the habit of building a mental model of how this business is actually making its money, how it's managing to be successful. What are the costs involved, what are the key processes that go into that business, how they actually built that machine that exploits that business opportunity to make some money. And as you get in the habit of doing that all the time, whether you're sitting at the airport or sitting at the bus stop or anywhere, you'll start to really develop this mindset of everything is a business opportunity. And you start to figure out ways to recombine different business models. And you might start looking at something where somebody is making some money right now and think, well, maybe I could make more money if I combine this idea that I got from another business with this idea, and I try to rearrange the business model in this way. And what you'll find is a surprising number of innovative businesses are actually just recombined business models of other people. One very obvious example of this is if you take all these online accounting packages like FreshBooks and things like that, which have made a lot of money for a lot of companies in the US and the UK. I don't know if there are any around here. There should be if there aren't. People often think that the innovation there was to go and create an accounting package that's online. But actually the innovation there was not so much in the software, which works more or less the same as the other software, but in the way that it was delivered, i.e. via a subscription model online, direct to the consumer, instead of going via software resellers and accountants. And that allowed them to go and access a different market and to go and create a new market and change the dynamics of the market by having just a different delivery piece. So it's getting a bit abstract there. But the point is, once you get into the habit of looking at every business as a sort of project to analyze how it works, you start to see more opportunities for yourself. And those opportunities, because they start with a market need, tend to be more valid than if you start with a cool idea that you want to build. And this leads you to generate what I like to call opportunity-led ideas. Now, it might still be a bad idea. In fact, even when you do this, most of them are still going to be bad ideas, and we'll go into much more detail tomorrow about how to go and weed out the bad ideas from the good ideas. But at least this hopefully gets you started with something that's missing from a lot of startups, which is a kind of business opportunity rather than just a project opportunity. The second topic I'm going to cover tonight is idea reach. Now, when we use the cool idea approach, we have a tendency to overlook barriers to what's going to stop us from actually making a business out of that idea. Because we're focused on building a product, and so we think, okay, well, I just need to build the product and then everything else will resolve itself. In practice, that never happens, but because of the focus on the cool idea, you end up forgetting about all the other problems that you're going to have afterwards. That's not necessarily so bad in terms of the global perspective on startups and entrepreneurship, because it means that a lot of businesses that wouldn't have been started do get started. And if you look at some of the biggest successes, they tend to be completely crazy ideas that sensible people would not have started. And so there is an argument to be made for starting crazy ideas that don't really have a market and figuring out a market as you go along. At least from an economic point of view, if you're looking at the overall worldwide economy and the value created for society. But I find that it's probably better to be a bit more selfish than that, because what you don't see when you look at those very successful businesses that started with a crazy idea is the other 999 businesses that also started with a crazy idea and didn't go anywhere. And the founders wasted years of their life building something that nobody wanted, that didn't work, that wasn't worth building. As a selfish person myself, I prefer to not waste 4 years of my life doing something that is not worth doing. And as entrepreneurs, I encourage you all to have that kind of selfishness where you want to build something that is actually good for you as well as for customers and for people out there. So from a personal perspective, it's good to have some kind of moderation about how crazy your idea is. And one concept that is often mentioned about this is the idea of the number of miracles that is going to take your startup to achieve success. And the idea is that if you need more than one miracle for your startup to get there, then it's going to fail. If you need several crazy, impossible things to happen one after the other in order to have a successful business, then you will not have a successful business. If you don't need any miracles, then it's probably an oversaturated market already, which is a problem that was mentioned earlier. But if you need more than one, then you're in trouble. So you kind of want to find stuff that's just one miracle away rather than 3 or 4 or 5 miracles away. And one way to deal with this, to approach this, is with this idea of idea reach. Now, I apologize for the drawings. I did them myself. And it turned out better than I thought, but still pretty bad. So idea reach is a pretty simple idea, fundamentally. There's some ideas that are within your reach, and some ideas that are outside of your reach. If we take an obvious example, if I wanted to start a startup that is creating a new type of car, that would be completely outside of my reach, because I don't know anything about cars. I don't have the financial resources you need to start building a new car. It costs $100 million or something to get a new car road approved. I don't have any of the engineering knowledge. I don't have any of the knowledge required to start that idea. So that idea is clearly and obviously outside my reach. There are some ideas that are just a little bit outside your reach. For example, on my second startup, Wubius, I co-founded that with an architect. And the construction industry was just outside my reach because I didn't know anything about the construction industry. But by combining ourselves together, we were able to go and access this idea that was within our common reach. Very often, the gap, or what people perceive as the gap between themselves and being able to do the idea is money, or it looks like money. In practice, it rarely is, but it often looks like the idea is almost within your reach. You just need a bit of money to be able to implement it and make it happen. Now, the thing is, the pitch of, I can build a great startup, all I need is $100,000, is a really, really bad pitch. And yet we hear it over and over again because people are choosing ideas, or rather choosing idea sizes that aren't quite right for them and for where they are at this point. The reality is that no professional investor is going to invest in you if all you're proposing is that you've got this great idea and you just need a bunch of money and you're going to make it happen. Because they won't believe you. Because if you were going to make it happen, if you were certain to make it happen, you would make it happen already without the $100,000. You would figure out a way to make it happen. And if you're not in the mindset of figuring out a way to make it happen, then the $100,000 is not going to help you to do that. It's just going to result in $100,000 of money being spent and things still not happening. Of course, there's always friends, family, and fools to try and raise money from. And you might well manage to raise some number of tens of thousands of pounds or euros or whatever currency you want from friends, family, and fools. But I really don't recommend it. And the reason for that is that they're a really, really awful source of funding. Friends and family are a very bad source of funding because it looks like you're selling equity. But actually what happens when the startup goes bad, if it fails, is suddenly it turns back into debt. It turns back into a loan. Because the fact is, I don't know how many here would feel comfortable telling their dads that they've lost all the retirement savings, but I certainly wouldn't. And with friends and family, you'll feel really morally obligated to go and repay them the money. So you kind of end up with this debt that's not even a legal debt, but it's kind of a moral debt that will follow you around until you finally repaid it. You might even lose some friends in the process. It's a really, really bad idea to take money from friends unless they're very wealthy and they're professional investors themselves and they know they can lose the money. As for fools, you'd think that that might be a better source, but actually the same thing happens with fools. Fools being defined as anybody who's not either a professional investor or an entrepreneur who has the experience of building startups and understands that startups can go bad and lose all the money that was put in them. What you often see happen with fools is that when the startup does go bad, and there's a very high chance that it will because startups have a very high failure rate, again, they start to think that the money was a kind of debt, or they start to look at it as a sort of normal investment. They think that the investment still exists and needs to be protected. This actually happened in a business that I was involved in, that some of the investors, when the business started failing, came back and said, well, we need to have a meeting and sit down and discuss what to do to protect our investment. Now, this is a business that had spent the money on developing a piece of software that wasn't making money. And the obvious conclusion for an entrepreneur is this business failed, the money is gone, and the business needs to be wound down. But instead, what followed was 9 months of back and forth legal letters, issues, meetings, etc., endless conversations about how to protect this investment that didn't even exist. And that's what you're setting yourself up for when you get investment from fools. So I hope I've made the case that they're an awful source of funding. Just have a sip of water. So if professional investors aren't going to invest, then what to do? Well, one thing you can do is obviously to actually pick ideas that are within your reach, where you don't need to raise $100,000 or learn how to design cars or do some kind of crazy stuff like that in order to build the idea. And that's probably a good principle, is to look at ideas that you can actually build. When you look at those opportunities out there, you will have a pretty good sense of whether it's something that you could build or it's something that you definitely can't build. You might look at, I don't know, the pavement in the street and think, well, somebody could build a business to deliver this more efficiently, but I don't know anything about pavement, so it's not going to be me. And once you find one of those opportunities which actually matches your skill set and your resources, then you found an idea that is actually interesting to you right now. Another thing you can do is shrink your idea. So take your great idea that's outside your reach and figure out a way to make it smaller, to make it something that you can actually build. And if you've got one of those $100,000 ideas, that is actually the preferred method for dealing with it. Go and find a way that you can build something that will make progress on this idea, that will start to generate some cash, start to close that loop that I mentioned yesterday, without having to get that resource that you don't have. Another thing you can do is extend your reach. The colors look really weird. Anyway, this is supposed to be blue and pink. I don't know. Okay. And the obvious way to do that is Cofounders, which is going to be our next topic. Interestingly, with Cofounders, you're not going to start something in that area in the middle, because that would be the worst thing to do, is something that's within both of your reaches by yourselves. But what actually happens when you put two people together is you don't get just two overlapping areas of reach. What you get is one much bigger area of reach when you have two people working together. For example, if we take my previous startup, Mobius, by joining forces with Bob, we were able to get to, Bob was my co-founder there, who's an architect. We got to an idea, this construction collaboration tool for architects, that was outside of both our individual reaches. And that's the ideal situation that you want. That's the ideal type of co-founder that you want to take on, is one where it enables you to reach this idea that would be outside of both your reaches. Which brings me nicely to the third topic of the night, which is co-founder horror stories. Hopefully, most people in this room will not have any kind of co-founder horror stories. Unfortunately, given how frequent they are, I'm afraid probably some people here will. The fourth part of the talk will be about principles of trying to avoid this. But first, to get you an idea of how bad it can get with co-founders, I'm going to tell you two stories of things that have actually happened, one to me and one to a startup that I'm advising. So the first one is Vocalix. I think I briefly mentioned this yesterday. But basically, Vocalix was a classic example of a co-founder fallout. I started Vocalix with one of my best friends, Steve. And right from the start, although we didn't even know it at the time, there was something not quite right there, which was that there was an uneven relationship between us. Steve had already built a few successful businesses. He was reasonably well off. I was just leaving Accenture. I was terrified of jumping into startups, of being completely exposed to the market. And I wasn't really extending his idea reach in any meaningful way. Really, I was just sort of keeping him company, which is not what you want as a startup founding team. You want to have a team where both are adding to the company, adding a significant amount of value to the company, ideally by extending that idea reach. Because we also had different starting points in terms of financial needs, that also set things up for problems later. And bear in mind that this is my best friend, and we had a very great friendship together. Now, as we proved the product was a flop after going and designing it in isolation without showing it to any customers, the business started to sort of show signs of strain. What happened was that, and actually I should caveat this slightly, which is I'm telling the story from my point of view. So you're going to get a very one-sided view of what happened there. If you talk to Steve, you might get a very different view. But that is the nature of co-founder disagreements, is you're going to get two different views from the two different co-founders. So anyway, the business started to disintegrate and to show signs of strain. And the way it manifested itself was first that Steve was not really that interested in continuing to invest lots of energy into this business. Because from his point of view, quite rightly, it wasn't really working. It was taking up a lot of time, a lot of energy, financial resources, and it wasn't really going to work. He could tell that the user base was shrinking. This business was clearly a failure. And so his very rational suggestion was to go and close this business. But of course, I had just quit my job to go and work on this business and placed all this strain of paying my salary on the business. So stopping the startup was completely unacceptable for me. I had put myself in a situation where, to exactly the opposite of my advice yesterday, where I had to make it work. This was a sink or swim situation. It had to work. And so Steve started talking about shutting down the business. This created a lot of strain between us. I started trying to convince him to transfer the whole business to me and let me try and figure out something to do with it. But then he rightly realized I wasn't quite ready to run that particular business because it had certain risks to do with the marketing scheme that it used. And I would probably get in trouble if I tried running that business by myself. So he disagreed with doing that after we ended up putting that agreement in writing. Things got pretty tense between me and Steve. And luckily, we had a common friend who's actually Steve's brother, Bob, who's actually my co-founder on the second startup, who happens to be a very good mediator and somebody who's really good at getting people to talk and sort of reducing the levels of conflict. And the luck that I had there was that this saved one of my most valuable friendships. And Steve is going to be my best man at my wedding next year. So we're still friends. This is not always the case. Just today I was reading an article by a famous American entrepreneur, a guy called Matt Marles. Posted an article yesterday about how it was his co-founder's birthday yesterday. But he wasn't going to wish him happy birthday because they were no longer on speaking terms after the business collapsed. Now, that's pretty sad. You don't want to have that happen. I said yesterday that the end of a startup can be an exhilarating, exciting time full of anticipation and possibilities, where if you're losing one of your best friends in the process, it's not going to be very happy. It's going to be pretty damn depressing. So it could have ended much worse. And more importantly, all the problems that we had were avoidable. We probably should never have started that business together, but at least if we'd followed some of the principles I'm going to talk about next, we would probably have avoided a lot of those problems and avoided all the strain and the tension. The second startup is going to remain unnamed for now because this thing is still going on. This is a startup that I mentored a few months ago as part of another incubator. And the two founders, let's call them John and Tim, basically joined that incubator to work on John's idea. Then they followed some of the techniques that I'll talk about tomorrow, and they proved that the idea wasn't worth following, and that it was a waste of time. And while they were sitting around thinking about what idea to work on next, they started working on a little thing that there was some demand from other startups there. And it turned out to be a really good idea, and a much better idea than what they had originally set out with. It all seemed to be going really well. It seemed like a startup success story. And the first hint I got that something wasn't quite right there was when I started to get conflicting communications from both of them, where they didn't seem to be talking anymore. And as I dug a bit more into it, I found out that Tim was basically doing all the programming work and had come up with the idea and had designed the product, was doing all the outreach to potential customers. And John was spending most of his time trying to be a CEO and boss Tim around. And therefore wasn't adding any value whatsoever to the startup, which is a pretty bad starting point for any company. This degenerated into them basically not talking to each other for a few days, then finally talking and deciding to part ways. And then you hope that was the end of the story, but actually what followed that is about 2 months of legal letters going back and forth, with John trying to get ownership of the stuff that Tim had developed, Luckily, the way the agreement had been phrased between them meant that it had been restricted to a specific product, which was completely different from what Tim had actually built. So Tim maintained the IP ownership of the product. Anyway, it gets messy. But the point is, those guys were supposed to be friends at the beginning. I think right now, John has finally, I'm told, finally signed a letter, an agreement, saying that he will not pursue any further claims against Tim. So this one might have a happy ending, but a lot of those stories don't have a happy ending. And all that stuff is avoidable. So let's go into how to actually avoid these kind of issues. Well, the first step, the first point worth making is about how to actually find those co-founders, because a lot of problems come from just how you go and find these people. And it's often compared that, it's often said that starting a business is a bit like getting married to somebody, starting a business together. And it is in some ways, because you're going to spend a lot of time with your co-founder over the next few years. So if you're not able to get along with them well, very well, you're going to be at each other's throats after a while, because startups are a bit like a pressure cooker. You're going to have a lot of really high stress issues to deal with. You're going to be dealing with all these problems, and you're going to have to deal with them under pressure, and you're going to be with each other all the time or talking several times a day. And if it's not somebody that you get along with, that's going to be very much a problem. So if it's like getting married, then how do you go about finding this wife? Now, hopefully this is not. I mean, this is a process that's getting more common in the modern age, but it's not a very common process for finding a wife, to go and sign up to a dating site, go to a club, ask everybody there if they want to marry you, and marry the person who says yes. Unfortunately, it is actually quite a common process for people to find co-founders. You see surprising amounts of events where they call it founder speed dating, or all sorts of, but there's actually a site called founderdating.com, where basically you can go and meet co-founders and go and start a business with them, even though you've never met them. To me, with my experience and with the experience of startups that I've seen, that sounds like a terrible idea. But some people seem to be doing that. It's too early to say how well those things are going to work. But it is still a relatively common process, and it is at the moment a relatively common process. And the result of that process is probably that there's going to be a lot of co-founder teams falling out. A better process, probably both for finding a wife and for finding a co-founder, is to go out and meet people, build friendships, work with people, do stuff with people, and then once you know them, once you actually know what they're like when they're working under pressure, in normal life and so on, then maybe decide to start a startup with them, rather than just bumping into them and saying, let's start a startup together. So the thing is, if you go to clubs and you ask every girl there, will you marry me? You will get some of them who say yes, probably. Well, you will get a very small percentage who say yes, and those are probably not the ones you want to marry. And the same is true for co-founders. If you met somebody just in a bar and or in a networking event, and you've just talked to them for a few days, and you say, let's start a startup together, and they say yes, run. Don't start a business with them. They're crazy. The best process, I think, is actually to start with an existing friend. Obviously, that's not always possible. You might not have a friend who's interested in starting startups. I've been lucky that a lot of my friends have turned out to be entrepreneurial. But if you can start with a friend that is already somebody that where you know how they deal with stress, with pressure, with difficulties, that takes away a lot of the uncertainties that you would otherwise have in starting a business with somebody. But of course, things can go bad, even with friends. As we saw in the Vocalix story, even with a friend, things can end really badly. So you really need to be extra careful. In fact, if you do start up with a friend, then you want to be even more careful than if you're starting up with somebody that you've met a year ago and you've become friendly with. Because as I said, you really don't want to lose a friend as well as a business when the business goes south. Based on that experience that I had with Vocalix and my observations, I put together an article which covers some of the points we're going to discuss tonight. And then develop this talk about how to deal with co-founders. But basically, the gist of it is that there's a number of relatively simple rules that if you're disciplined enough to follow them, you can massively reduce the risk of things going really bad if the startup does fall down. So what can you do? Well, when co-founders break up, it's usually because there's some kind of massive disagreement. They disagree about something to do with the direction of the business. They disagree about who should get paid how much. They disagree about share amounts. They disagree about all sorts of things. And usually that happens when they haven't discussed things in advance. So the obvious thing to do is to actually discuss things in advance. Disagreements between co-founders, I mentioned earlier the Startup Genome project, and the top reason was that startups building a product nobody wants. The second most likely reason is co-founder disagreement. That's the second most likely cause of death for startups. Because what happens is that once a major disagreement is reached, once you've got this clash of opinions, everybody's feeling very heated and very emotional about it. And so they're not going to want to think rationally, they're going to just want to push their point forward. And so you're not going to be able to resolve the disagreement once it is actually happening. So you want to deal with those disagreements before they exist, when everybody's cool-headed, when nobody thinks it's going to happen to them. There's the other person who's going to say, I want to do something else. The first cause of disagreements, and this is especially the case with friends, is implicit agreements, like icebergs that you don't even know they're there. The reason that happens is that when you're dealing with a friend, you make a lot of assumptions about what they're thinking and what they're agreeing with and disagreeing with. And one of those assumptions, or several of those assumptions, are almost guaranteed to be wrong. So the first principle of how to avoid these kind of problems is to make those agreements explicit rather than implicit, and try to make as much as possible explicit. So one really useful question there is, what do we both mean by ... and then cover almost every single aspect of the startup to make sure that you're using the same vocabulary. For example, what do we mean by the business is successful? What is success for both of us? If I'd had that discussion with Steve before we started VocalX, it would have been pretty obvious that we had very different definitions there, and that there was going to be a problem later on, and we could have discussed ahead of time what to do if I felt the business was successful but he didn't. What do we mean by the business is unsuccessful? The reverse side of that. What do we mean by working hard on the startup? One very common point of friction between founders is that one of them is usually working harder than the other. It's very likely, unless they're both working exactly the same amount. And even if they are, usually you'll feel like you're working more than the other person. So what do we actually mean by that? How can we make this explicit so that we're both happy that we're each pulling our own weight? There's a longer list of those on my previous blog. If you just Google for starting up with a friend, you'll find that article. And there's a list of useful questions that you can go through. I'm not going to go through all of them today. So the principle there is don't assume what people are thinking. Check, ask them, discuss those things. Make agreements explicit. Now, how do you actually make agreements explicit? Well, bringing up the points is one first step. Obviously, you want to actually have the discussion. But the discussion itself is not enough, because you're still going to overlook a lot of key points. So the second thing you want to do is make sure that you actually detail those agreements. So use explicit numbers rather than just saying, yeah, we're going to give it, it's not going to be successful if it hasn't worked after some time. Exactly how much time is that? How much money does it need to make to be successful? How many hours a week do you expect to be putting into this? How much of your personal money are you going to invest in this? How many expenses should you be taking out of this? How much money do you want to get for the business if you decide to sell it? So all these kind of questions where you can think about them in advance and resolve those problems before they happen, and avoid the massive fallout when the problem suddenly comes up unexpected. Now, discussing those things, even in detail, is really a great start. But what I found is the most useful next step is to actually write things down. Because until it's written down, it's really implicit. There's nothing that focuses the mind quite so much on agreements and disagreements as a piece of paper that actually says, you know, we're going to do this. This is what we're aiming for, etc. This is what each of us is going to do. Once you actually start putting things on paper, people take it seriously, and they really pay attention, and they really put the level of detail that needs to be there. Also, it means that people aren't going to forget what they agreed, because 2 years down the line, when the disagreement finally explodes, people might not remember that 2 years earlier they said, yeah, okay, so if a person walks out, then the other one gets all the equity or whatever. The clear writing really brings down disagreements. One way I like to look at it is that writing is like coding for people. So you put it in code and you get to see the bugs come out. One other principle that's really important is don't avoid the scary stuff. Don't be scared of discussing the bad stuff. So when you're starting a business, it can be very difficult to get into discussion of you know, what happens if we decide to quit the startup? What happens if one of us decides, or both of us? Or what happens if you know, we're not interested anymore, we decide to join another startup? There's all these negative scenarios, and it feels kind of down-putting to be discussing all that stuff before you even get started. But usually the stuff that's going to bring those disagreements to the surface is actually negative stuff. So don't be afraid of discussing negative scenarios. In fact, aim for those negative scenarios, because those are the most interesting ones. And finally, one really important point is don't make it work at all costs. As I said yesterday, you don't want to be in a situation where it's a kind of one-shot, your only shot at success. And you're not in that situation. The fact is, if it doesn't work with this person, it might work with the next, or the next, or the next, or by yourself. There's going to be many other chances that you're going to get to go and start a business. It's not your only chance to start a business with this person. So if you feel like there's a major disagreement there and you're not going to be agreeing, don't assume that things are going to get better after a while, because they're probably not. If at the beginning you're already seeing that there's some kind of problem simmering under the surface, chances are it's going to get worse with time and eventually come to the surface and possibly kill your startup and maybe your friendship as well. So that's that last point. So in short, make the agreements explicit, detail those agreements, write things down, don't be afraid of discussing those negative scenarios, and don't make it work at all costs. Finally, the last point I'm going to cover is about shares and employees and so on. Now, this is a very personal viewpoint evolved over the last 5 years or so of running startups. And many people will violently disagree with my viewpoint on this, and that's okay. Each of us, with time, will develop our own viewpoint about this. But I thought it would be useful for you guys to hear what my viewpoint is after doing this for a few years. Ultimately, you're going to have to make your own mind about this. The shares and employees and stuff like that is something that ends up being part of your startup's culture, and so it's ultimately up to you to decide how you want to shape that. So this is my viewpoint. Now, the Silicon Valley model is all about options and share grants and stuff like that. Basically, if you want to hire people in an early startup in Silicon Valley, you can't get away without giving them shares. You're not going to be able to hire anybody without giving them shares. They expect that. However, this is not Silicon Valley. In fact, most of the world is not Silicon Valley. Even London, which has a thriving startup hub, is not Silicon Valley. So you don't have to do the same thing as those Silicon Valley startups. You don't have to default to this idea of giving shares to employees. You can try other paths. Now, options and shares and so on really only make sense in a certain context, which is the typical Silicon Valley startup thing, where you take angel investment, you take VC investment, and then you get acquired, or you go public, or you do something like that, and the shares suddenly have values, or the options can be realized. A lot of businesses, a lot of very successful businesses, never take investment and never go public. Giving shares in a business like that is pointless. They're not really worth anything unless somebody is willing to buy them. And if the only person who's willing to buy them is you, the founder of the company, then you're not really giving anything of value to your employees by giving them shares. On the other hand, if you give shares out to people, you create a lot of headaches for yourself, because suddenly you have shareholders, and so you have statutory duties to shareholders. You have to report the progress of the company to them, and you're liable to follow your director's duties because the shareholders can sue you if you don't do what you're supposed to as a director of a company. At least in the UK, it's like that. I assume it's fairly similar in Serbia. One common thing between most successful entrepreneurs, at least outside of Silicon Valley, is that they tend to really, really protect their shares. They really don't give shares unless they absolutely have to. And there's a pretty good reason for that as well, which is that if your shares are actually worth something, then you want to keep as many of them as possible. And if you can figure out a way to keep them, then you should do so. Another really good reason for not giving out shares is that actually the motivation of giving out shares is not really that clear. Even if you're talking about a startup that is going to exit, is going to be acquired, is going to go IPO or whatever, you need a pretty large exit in order for shares to be really motivating for people. And if you take a typical very high share percentage for an employee of a startup, which is, let's say, 0.5% or so, like something like that. That's usually if you're a relatively early employee of a startup, like like some kind of successful startup. You might end up with something like 0.5%. Typically, you'll end up with much less than that. With 0.5%, you would get rich if the company exists for $1 billion. But there's something like, 10 companies every, a few companies a year that exit at a $1 billion and above value. If the startup exits at 100 million and above, you're getting $500,000. That's better. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's already not that huge an amount of money. If the company exits for a much more sensible and reasonable $10 million, you're only getting $50,000 out of that exit. So if the employee is sensible, if they're rational, they're not going to be all that motivated about having 0.5% of a startup, because it's not really worth that much money, and plus actually the startup itself has a big question mark on its value. So really the shares are kind of worthless until the startup is worth something. So it doesn't actually even work as a motivator for a lot of companies. Out of curiosity, so I'm going to ask a question, and if the answer is yes, I want you all to raise your hand. Now, would you feel motivated, would you feel like you're the owner of a company if you own 50% of that company? Raise your hand if that's true. 50%. 50. I would hope to see a bit more hands going up there. Come on. Would you feel motivated if you own 30% of that company? Okay, still quite a lot of hands. What about if you own 20% of that company? Still a fair few hands. What if you own just 10% of that company? This is an early startup that's unproven, and you own 10% of it, do you feel like you're an owner of this company? There's actually no hands already at 10%. And this is actually what I always say is the psychological barrier there. Around 20%, people start to feel like they're an owner of the company, and below that, they don't really feel like it really puts them in the mindset of being an owner. And presumably when you're hiring employees, you're hiring smart people. And if they're smart, they're not going to feel like you giving them 1% of the company makes them an owner. You might say, oh yes, you're an owner of the company now, but they're not gonna really believe that. So you might ask, so what do you actually do about motivation to get people to actually be motivated about working on the startup? Because you can't give everybody 20%. Otherwise, you can only have 5 people, and that doesn't include you. So that wouldn't really work. So what about motivation? How do you get employees motivated if they don't own a share? Now, the lucky thing is there are other ways to get employees motivated. You might remember the cathedral parable that I said, or the stonecutters parable that I said yesterday, about how that demonstrate that you're much more motivated if you have a sense of purpose, a vision of what you're trying to accomplish. That is probably one of the best motivators for employees, is to have some kind of vision of what they're trying to achieve, feel like what they're doing is worthwhile. Has anybody heard of this a talk called Drive, which talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose? 1, 2, not many people. I strongly recommend you go and you find this. There's an awesome YouTube video where the guy draws the talk as he talks it, or somebody else is drawing the talk as the speaker is talking.
It's much more familiar.
Yeah. Okay. So it's called Drive. And the key principle that comes out of that talk is that actually money doesn't incentivize most people. Money is a kind of hygiene factor, and you need to have enough money to feel comfortable, to feel that you don't have not enough money. But beyond that, giving more and more money to people doesn't necessarily motivate them, unless it's life-changing amounts of money, and then actually can have negative motivation effects, which is what this thing. Actually, that's not even life-changing. But anyway, the point is, what the talk suggests is that there's 3 key things which are known to actually increase the engagement of people and increase how motivated they feel and make them feel driven to get some stuff done. One is autonomy, as in being able to control what they do on a day-to-day basis and not being micromanaged, not having somebody hovering behind them telling them do this, do that, do that. Having the control to decide how they're going to do their work. The second one is mastery, the feeling of learning every day, learning, or at least every week, learning something new and getting better at what you do, and acquiring new skills, becoming a better person through your work. And the third one is purpose, so having an actual purpose to all this thing, having some kind of vision that you're trying to achieve, something worth doing. And if you structure the roles inside your company to actually give this to people, so if you make sure that you don't hire people that you're going to need to micromanage, you hire people who are able to work by themselves, and you give them that autonomy, and you structure the roles so that they will be learning, and you keep changing and shifting the roles so that they're always learning something new, and you do convey this vision to them and make sure that they actually understand what you're trying to do here and they're motivated by your vision, you're going to get some pretty motivated employees without giving them any shares. That's certainly what we're finding on my current business, on Grantry, and it's also what the wisdom of the age seems to say. Now, there's one other concern though, which is fairness. If you do build a company and you end up selling it, it isn't really fair if everybody else who's worked for you to help you build this thing doesn't get some kind of reward. And in fact, if you don't structure something to reward people in such a case, they will feel a bit unfairly treated, especially when they keep hearing about Silicon Valley startups getting options and shares and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it is quite reasonable that if these people really did help you build this company, they should get some slice of the pie so if you do go and exit the company. But that doesn't need shares. 37 Signals, the company behind Basecamp, have a model that they explain on their blog, which is a pretty good model. We're applying it on Grantry as well. It seems to work pretty well. The idea is that the typical options pool for employees is anyway about 5%. So typically about 5% of the shares of the overall company are distributed as options to employees. So they say, well, let's just take this exit event. Let's imagine that the company is sold. If the company is sold, then by contract, 5% of the sale amount will go into a kind of bonus pool for employees. And how it is apportioned depends on seniority. The way they do it is that every year with the company you earn a point, up to 5 points, and then you have as many shares as you have points. So that way, if you've been with the company for 5 years, you're going to get a good share based on the number of employees and the sale price. And that is a reasonable way to go. A couple more points I want to make. This is kind of like almost loose points, but about co-founders. One is about business guys. One thing that happened in that second horror story that I mentioned with the unnamed startup is that Tim, the tech guy, even while the whole thing was disintegrating, still felt like he needed to go and find a co-founder, find a business guy to start with because he was a tech guy. The reality is that the term business guy means absolutely nothing, and you should never get somebody just because they're a business guy. Typically, the reason why people who are technical go and look for somebody to handle the business side of things is just because they don't really know how it works, and they kind of want to offload the responsibility of thinking about all this stuff to somebody else. And that's a natural instinct, but it's not a good idea. Ultimately, company administration can be a pain, no doubt, but it's really not rocket science. Everybody who runs a business does it. There's people you can delegate the most complicated pieces to. They're called accountants and lawyers. And it's definitely not worth giving up 50% or sometimes more of your equity to some guy who's not really adding much to the business just because they're a business guy and you're a tech guy, so you don't know anything about business. Just go and learn business. If you're a tech guy, you can bring somebody who is, for example, an expert at product design. That would be a good person to bring into your startup. They might extend the reach of what you can do. You might bring somebody who's an industry expert in the topic that's in the field that you want to address. That would be a good person to bring in. But somebody who's just bringing in the fact that they're a business guy or they're going to do business development, which is completely meaningless in the early stages of the startup, is not something that is useful at that stage of the startup. Conversely, dev guys don't get away with it so easily either. If you are a business guy, or rather if you are somebody who doesn't have a tech background but has some ideas that you want to implement, don't go and try to bring in somebody as a dev guy. You get this quite a lot in startup networking events, in those kind of events where people are looking for co-founders. Usually more than half of them are business guys looking for a techie to build their solution. If you're somebody without technical skills, first of all, pick an idea that doesn't have a lot of technical complexity to it. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're giving away 50% of your equity just for somebody to do the implementation of a simple product. If you're going to start up with somebody who's a dev guy, you want to make sure that, as we saw before, you've gone through this process of getting to know them and working with them, and you want to start with them because you actually feel like you guys can do something really great together, not because you've got this idea and you want a dev guy to go and build it. There are companies, there was a guy called Bal, who was here yesterday, who's actually a sponsor of this. There are companies that will help people without the technical skills to go and build the product. My advice would be to go and shrink the idea until you don't actually need a product. But the point is, you can outsource development. It's tricky, but it can be done. And it's much cheaper than giving somebody 50% of your equity just to write some code. And also it actually works better because usually you end up having a really bad relationship with that person. They don't feel like a co-founder. Also because usually you don't give them 50%, you give them like 10%. And then you wonder why they don't feel like a co-founder. And the final idea there is never say this. I'll pay you in shares is basically you're immediately conveying to the person that you work with that you don't value their time, that you don't value your own shares. As I said earlier, experienced entrepreneurs protect their shares like blood. They really don't want to give away shares unless they absolutely have to. And giving shares in exchange for work that can be paid for is definitely not something you want to do. So, we've talked about ideas, good and bad, and what makes a good idea and a bad idea. We've talked about this concept of idea reach, which I hope is useful. We shared some co-founder horror stories, a couple of them. We've gone through this how-to of how to go and actually find a co-founder and work with them and avoid problems, and shared some thoughts on shares and employees. That's it for tonight. Thank you. Any questions tonight?
I was wondering if you could give us an example of a miracle that would be okay to have, or idea that would be okay to pursue, and also an example of what kinds of miracles would you need to have and to say, okay, this is not something that's fine to do.
Okay, so the question is, what kind of an example of a miracle that the miracles I mentioned earlier, and example of a series of miracles that is not okay to have in a startup. Well, one example of a miracle is we're going to get millions of users. So if your startup, everything else is predetermined, very certain, and it depends on getting a few millions of users, then you can go and try to build a startup there. It clearly has a barrier to entry, it's difficult to build, but there are people who have gone and solved that miracle, and if you really work at it, you can probably figure out a way to solve that miracle. And yeah, there's a lot of wisdom out there for how to go and get users, and if you build the right kind of product and you do the right kind of marketing, you may well be able to get to solve that one miracle. However, if your startup plan is something like, we're going to get millions of users, and then we're going to convince the record companies to give us money for this stuff, and then we're going to, like, God knows what else, go and bring in some other industry that's very hostile and get them on the table as well. Each of those is a miracle. And if you've got several of those, as I was saying earlier, then chances are you won't even make it past one, let alone get all three of them. So, okay. Yeah?
And can you tell us something about investing?
About investing. Vesting. Well, the next talk is actually about vesting, so I'll leave that to the next speaker. Yeah?
Okay, so because you can experience both with good and say bad co-founders, so during the process of meeting and becoming a friend with someone you feel like being your future co-founder, what would be more of a decision maker for you? Something like common sense, or you trust your gut feeling more than doing the final decision of someone becoming your co-founder?
Okay, so the question is, what would be the major decider for what makes a good co-founder if you go through the process of going and meeting friends and then deciding on a co-founder? First of all, you said that I've had the experience of having good and bad co-founders. I think that's slightly unfair. All of the co-founders are good. It's just the way we set up the relationship was bad. Steve is a very good person. Bob is a very good person. Paulino, sitting over there, is a very good person as well. About the decision factor, I'll draw back to one image that Paul Graham actually uses, which is, I think, a very interesting point there. The kind of people you want as co-founders on a startup are people, obviously, that you get along with and you're going to be good friends. And that has to be a sine qua non condition. If you don't really get along with them, if you feel like there's something slightly odd, like the relationship isn't quite working, it's going to get much worse with time. So don't start with them. But the one quality that Paul Graham says he looks for, and I like the sound of it, is that you want to look for people who are animals. As in people who are just determined and obsessive to extremes. The kind of people who will just, push something way beyond where normal people would have given up. The kind of people who are who will go and decide to chart their weight on a chart on the wall while they're going and trying to do some kind of weight loss on the wall in their kitchen. Or the kind of people who will go to conferences every day for a whole week and networking events in the evening as well, just to go and try to get those early leads. You want these kind of people to start with, rather than people who are kind of a bit chilled out and normal. You want abnormal people, basically, animals. If you can't think of, the way Paul Graham phrased it is, if you can't fit them into the sentence, Joe is an animal, then don't start up with them. That's one criteria you can use. Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, I have a pretty basic one.
Okay.
Is it a must to have a co-founder? What are the pros and cons?
So the question is it a must to have a co-founder? What are the pros and cons of having a co-founder? There's a number of good reasons to have a co-founder. There's a number of not so good reasons. The good reasons are things like extending your idea reach, or because they bring some kind of resources that you don't have, some kind of skill that you don't have, which is all kind of related to the whole idea reach. The less good reasons are things to do with basically just feeling lonely, needing some kind of emotional support through the startup. That is not necessarily a bad reason, it's just not quite as good as the other one. So, for example, my first startup, Vocalix, I could never have started that by myself. There's no chance, but Steve could have. I needed both the emotional support, the business knowledge, Steve's skills at marketing, etc. I needed a lot of input of skills from this other person in order to be able to start. And there is certainly a lot of comfort also in just not being alone starting a startup, which is why statistically bigger companies, the ones that make crazier bets, the bigger startups, tend to have more than one founder, because there are some serious up and downs of building a sort of what I call a moonshot company, something where you're going to either make it to 100 million or go bust. And having another person there kind of keeps you sane and keeps you emotionally more stable, as long as you actually get along with them. In terms of pros and cons, I think that varies through your life as your experience builds up. I mentioned this startup skill set yesterday. If you're at a point where you've already mastered all these key skills of starting a business, you probably don't need a co-founder in terms of skills anymore. If you're still very early and you've only got one or two of those under your belt, then it's probably helpful to have somebody else also who helps with some of the other ones. So it depends on where you are in your life, basically. Anyone else? Yeah?
What about multiple co-founders, like more than two?
So what about multiple co-founders? All my startups have been with only 2 founders. Well, actually, I lie. Rubius made the mistake of bringing in, I think at one point there were about 7 people who called themselves co-founders. That is a disaster. There's never going to be 7 people who are really co-founders of the business. The magic number seems to be 2 or 3. More than 3, you're starting to get politics. You're necessarily not going to get 4 people who are all pulling their own weight. I mean, it can happen. There are exceptions. I do know some businesses which are started by 4 people. But the more people you add into the mix, the more chances there are for disagreements between them, and the less likelihood there is that all of them are really adding to the startup. So my advice would be to keep it down to 2 or 3 or 1, rather than 4 or more. Anyone else? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.